they needed a new church. Formed in 1888, St. Josaphat Parish was mostly made up of Polish immigrants who had made a home in Milwaukee. But in 1889, their first church burned down. They were able to put up a new building, but it turned out to be too small for what was becoming the largest Polish parish in Wisconsin. So the pastor, Father Wilhelm Grutzo, led the charge to build something big enough to support his 12,000 parishioners. Yes, 12,000, in the late 19th century. He hired an architect, and together they came up with a design that was basically a smaller version of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The same huge central dome and the same cross-shaped floor plan. But even so, they had a problem. Grand plans tend to need grand materials. And grand materials tend to cost a lot of money. Now, to be sure, 12,000 parishioners is a lot of people, but demographics were working against them. The congregation was largely factory workers and laborers, people who had crossed the ocean with almost nothing to start a new life in America. People that the broader culture could easily overlook. And so that particular plan seemed to be out of reach. But God, the stone that the builders rejected, has become the very head of the corner. In Chicago, 90 miles south of Milwaukee, the U.S. Post Office and Customs House was being demolished to make way for something more modern. Father Wilhelm somehow arranged to buy the demolition materials, the literal rubble, for about $20,000, a fraction of its value. It took 500 railroad cars to carry those salvaged stones, columns, archways, cornices, foundations, from Chicago to Milwaukee. The architect had to rework his plans to repurpose the discarded stones for holy use. Unskilled laborers, the parishioners themselves, sorted through the rubble in an empty field, actively fitting the discarded pieces together to build one of the most remarkable churches in the region. The Basilica of St. Josaphat was consecrated in 1901. It was designated a minor basilica in 1929. To this day, it dominates the Milwaukee skyline, and it is built almost entirely from stones that others might have cast off or thrown away. The stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner. When the Apostle Peter quoted that psalm to the exiles scattered across Asia Minor, he had no idea that a church patterned after the basilica that bears his name 2,000 years later and an ocean away would become a sermon in stone. Because that is exactly what Peter is giving this scattered church. He's not giving them a new doctrine to learn. He is not just giving them encouragement to build their spirits. He is giving them a vision of who they are in Christ. He is reminding them that while they may be rejected by the culture, they are not rejected by God. That while they may be rejected by their communities, they are not rejected by God. They are not rubble. They are not leftovers. They are not the rejected pieces of someone else's empire. They are living stones being built together into a spiritual house. Stones are notoriously known for not being alive. We think of rocks as some of the deadest things we can imagine. Not things that have died, but things that never had life in them to begin with. And that was also the case in the first century. And it's part of what would have made Peter's words genuinely surprising to his original audience. 1 Peter 2:4 says, "Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight." Before Peter casts the exiles as living stones, he first points to Christ and calls him a living stone. Jesus Christ, rejected by mortals, but chosen by God and precious in God's sight. Christ rejected by mortals, a lot like the exiles Peter is addressing. Christ chosen by God, as are the exiles, as Peter reminded them at the beginning of the letter. Christ precious in God's sight. Come to him, Peter says. And there is a tiny grammatical detail here that matters. Peter does not say that Christ is the living stone, so we must all do our best to live up to that. He says that Christ is a living stone. Not to reduce his uniqueness, not to diminish him as the foundation, but to build a shared identity. An identity he invites the exiles into. Verse 5 begins, "Like living stones, let yourselves be built." We are part of that shared identity. We are like living stones as Christ is a living stone. Peter is essentially saying that Christ is the most important living stone in the structure, but he is not the only living stone. He is the stone that provides the shape and sets the direction and gives it life. But we are also part of the structure. 1 Peter 2:5 says, "Like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." After inviting the exiles into this shared identity as living stones, Peter exhorts them to let themselves be built into a spiritual house. We are not merely invited to sit idly and simply admire Jesus as the most precious stone. We are invited into something active. But it is an invitation, not coercion. Let yourselves be built suggests participation. God is the builder, but we are not passive rubble. We are invited to yield, to trust, to be placed, to be joined. This is something we are invited into. This is active participation with Christ. And it is participation with one another. Be built into a spiritual house. A cornerstone alone can establish the shape of a house, but Peter's vision is not a cornerstone sitting by itself in an empty field. Peter sees a whole spiritual house rising from that cornerstone. It takes many stones. That's why Jesus is not the only stone. That's why we are not called into this participation as individuals. We are not called to do this as something that's just between Jesus and me. We are not artisanal stones, each standing alone, doing our own thing. This is collective. This is communal. This is something we do together, all of us together in participation with Jesus Christ. And this is where Peter says something absolutely staggering. He does not say, "Some of you are living stones, and the rest of you can admire the building." He does not say, "Some of you are priests, and the rest of you can watch from a distance." He says, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people." Tomorrow is May the 4th, and true nerds know that that is Star Wars Day. And if you have seen my office, you know that I am not neutral on Star Wars. I bring this up because one of the things that Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, tried to remind us, whether you loved the movie or had other feelings, is that the Force was never supposed to belong to one famous bloodline only. That this sacred calling was not locked away in one family name. It was not reserved for the impressive people with the recognizable pedigree. And because Episode 8, The Last Jedi, put that idea so bluntly, some people had big feelings. But what Peter is saying is far deeper than that. Because in the world of the Bible, priesthood was not something you simply decided to pursue as a career path. You did not wake up one morning and say, I think I'll apply to be a priest. Temple priesthood was tied to lineage, to tribe, to family. It was bound up with the descendants of Aaron and the tribe of Levi. It was not something you could earn, something you could learn, or something you could volunteer your way into. And yet Peter writes this in 1 Peter 2:9. "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the excellence of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Peter is reaching deep into Israel's own scriptures, into the language of covenant and calling, and he is placing that identity on this scattered church. The presence of God is not locked behind an elite religious class. The work of God is not reserved for the impressive, the powerful, or the professionally holy. In Christ, the whole church becomes a royal priesthood. The whole church becomes a people who bear God's presence. The whole church becomes a people called to proclaim God's mighty acts. Peter is telling these exiles that their identity is not determined by the family they were born into, the status they hold in society, the approval they receive from their neighbors, or the power they have in the empire. Their identity is found in Christ. They have become God's people. And because they are God's people, they have become God's priesthood. And the second half of verse 9 tells us why. In order that you may proclaim the excellence of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. In other words, this identity is not something we hoard. It is something we proclaim. God does not call us a royal priesthood so we can admire ourselves in the mirror. God calls us a royal priesthood so that our lives can point beyond ourselves to the mercy of the one who has called us out of darkness and into light. Because of the resurrection, we are different. Because we are being built together, we are changed. Not because of our own effort, not because we're trying harder or behaving better, but because of the mercy and grace of God. 1 Peter 2:10 says, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. We are different. We are now a people, and we have received mercy. It is a beautiful thing to be called a royal priesthood. It is a humbling thing to realize you are a living stone, being built into a magnificent spiritual house in participation with Christ and with fellow believers. But let me tell you something about building a basilica out of salvaged stone. It is exhausting work. Those parishioners in Milwaukee didn't just stand around admiring the rubble. They had to lift it. They had to haul it. They had to endure the friction of fitting rough edges together. And you cannot do that kind of heavy lifting if you are starving. You cannot serve as a royal priesthood if you yourself are spiritually empty. Peter knows this, which is why before he tells this scattered church that they are being built together into a spiritual house, he tells them that they need to be fed. Let's go back to the very beginning of this morning's passage. In verses 2 and 3, before any mention of stones or temples, Peter writes this: like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. God will not hand you a royal calling and send you to the construction site on an empty stomach. God feeds you. God sustains you for the work of being built together. So if you are tired today, come to Christ. If you feel overlooked, come to Christ. If you feel like rubble, come to Christ. If you feel like you do not know where you fit anymore, come to Christ. Come to him, the living stone, rejected by mortals but chosen and precious in God's sight. Come and receive the mercy that makes us God's people. Come and be nourished by the grace that gives us life. You are a royal priesthood. You are living stones. You are being built together. So come hungry. Taste the goodness of God and let yourselves be built together.